So it's a chilly morning this morning, and while we cook breakfast, I'm going to finish off this painting. I'm doing it with colored pencils on an 8x10 art board that I primed with acrylic spray paint. Makes for a slicker surface that allows me to move the paint around a little bit more. Let's see how this goes. Let's get started. This is where we camped, and it's also the view that I decided to paint. I'm not too good at painting vehicles, but I decided that I wanted to capture the place we camped because winter wasn't quite over this high up in the mountains, and the trees were still pretty barren, and the ground was quite muddy with only spots of snow, so it was pretty brown. This little stream had plenty of water in it, though. All in all, it was a really nice place, and I set up on the only dry spot we had near the campground, and then I started to sketch. I roughed in the truck with a blue watercolor pencil. Well, it was actually teal color, I guess, and I'm trying to focus on just blocking in the shape of it, rather than outlining it. I feel it's easier to just focus on the blocky shapes first. That way I'm not too worried about being a perfect artist. I guess it's easier for me to start messy and improve things as I go. I didn't put things exactly as they appeared either. I put that little swag tent further to the right of the truck, and I placed the trees and the mountains close to, but not exactly where I saw them. I kind of regret putting the truck as centered as it was, but it and the camping spot was kind of the point of the whole experience, so I went with it. I also never know how dark to go with the sky, but I like to block it in with some light blue, just so it gives me something to work toward. And this part is the part I like best, where I wet the pigment with a brush. This acrylic prime paper is pretty non-absorbent, so the watercolor pencil spreads around quite nicely. I like it that way. I'm using a synthetic squirrel brush, and it seems to be working pretty well. It's not lifting up too much paint, and it's spreading it around nice, and it's keeping the water fairly controlled. And now I'm using this graphite pencil. After I blocked in the shape of the truck and felt like I had good enough proportions, and even though it still has a long ways to go to get finished, I'm using the pencil to kind of set in a rough outline of things, because once I wet the watercolor pencil, the non-graphite lines are going to disperse. So I'm hoping the graphite pencil will help solidify some of the main objects. I can always erase the pencil later as needed, but I wanted to kind of keep the graphite as a way to have some anchor points for some of the bigger shapes and objects. I like using the carpenter's pencil because it has a really thick lead, and it keeps me from being too detailed, too early in the process. Details will come later. So this campground is in Ophir, Utah. Ophir is an old ghost town where there used to be a pretty big silver, copper, and lead mine. There's a public campground at the end of the canyon that the mines in the ghost town is in, and as I understand it, a lot of people recreate up here in the summer. It's mostly off-roading, I think, but even though it's muddy this week, it's still a cool place to visit. You can still see a lot of old mining equipment and relics of the past. I especially like this old cabin and some of the old stores along the main street. I might come back here in the summer and paint some of these other areas that I've seen. The campground is a pretty area, but to prove that not everything is perfectly glorious when you're painting outside, you can see that I'm placed directly in front of the toilets. It was the only dry place in the area, but I was looking away from the toilet, so no big deal there. Fortunately, it was early enough in the season that it didn't stink. Now that I've got the basic gist of the drawing with the graphite, and with the mountains and the bigger objects, I can settle in and do some of the local colors of the trees. I'm using mostly olive greens and some burnt sienna to kind of just get that basic look. It's kind of gray here, but I wanted some colors, so at some point I might be using my artistic liberties to make this place feel like it felt, rather than just look like it looked. Because it felt like a really cool place, and I liked it, even though it wasn't the perfect time of year. The water and the brush I'm using spreads out the pigment nicely, and it's always one of my favorite parts of doing this type of painting. And here I'm trying to just dab the brush lightly to maintain a bit of texture. Part of this early process is just to get the feel of the composition and of the place. And I'm still not too worried about details at this point. That will come later. Part of what I'm doing is also just getting rid of the white of the paper. And even though I will introduce white back into it later to represent the snow, I wanted to do that part a little later, and so I'm just kind of toning the paper at this point. For the truck, I'll add more details on that too. And you'll see that I'll even erase some of the lines that I've drawn here, because it still needs some better rendering. But it's kind of difficult to paint details in the outdoors for me. There's so much going on, there's a lot of movement, and I'm still trying to go pretty fast, partially because breakfast will be ready soon. That fire finally has some good coals, and I'm sure my son's getting a little hungry at this point. But I'm still trying to get some of the form of those mountains defined. And for that I'm using a little bit of cooler bluish purple to kind of flesh out the rocks and the shadows on that distant mountain. It's interesting to try to paint the color of snow, because you can't just leave it white, so I'm using a really diluted purple to kind of just show the snow that's in the shadow versus the snow that's in the sun. For the snow that's in the sun, I'm using a really pale yellow, because it's reflecting a little bit of the sunshine. It's kind of the only way I can think of to make the mountain look less flat and have more depth. When you're out painting, a lot of times it's good to use some of the colors that you're seeing that you know the camera won't pick up on. And I'm just trying to get a feel for the place, because I'll end up finishing this painting at home with the help of my reference photos. But starting out in the field is a good way to study the things that my camera can't really pick up on. And it's part of the process. It'll help me remember what I'm seeing, because I was recording it with a sketch. But it's a lot of back and forth and trial and error. I lose track of time when I do this, and I ended up spending more than an hour painting, which was plenty of time for the breakfast to finish, so I did take a break for that. Wasn't really sure how to do the foreground objects, partially because the chairs kept moving around after we ate breakfast. And we cleaned up and put most things away, and I'm actually sitting in my truck for this part while I waited for, well, I can't remember what. Either way, I had a good start and I had some photo references. I rarely finish everything in the field anyway. But I also am rarely successful in starting a painting at home. So I really like to get outside and start painting in the field, because it's just fun for me, and I get more inspiration from real life than I do from photos. Plus, it makes for a fun video. So if you like what you're seeing, hit the like button for me. Now that I was working from a photo, I decided to move the placement of that tent back to where it was in the photo reference. The acrylic prime paper made it easy for me to use an eraser, and it was really pretty easy to erase away most of my foreground camping things. I've tried a lot of different surfaces to draw on and paint on with my videos, and this is one of my favorites. But to be honest, I just like trying new things. And each surface and each painting medium or pencil has a different property, and they're all fun to try. And I like to explore techniques and art supplies as much as I like to explore new places. Here I'm using a chalk pastel pencil because, like the graphite, I found it doesn't move much with the water, and I wanted a different color from the graphite. So this General's chalk pastel pencil was my attempt to see if I could do an underdrawing with something besides graphite. And now I'm at home, and I'm going to finish this painting up. And to be frank, it's easier to paint at home. You have all your supplies with you, the table is steady, and you get a lot fewer distractions. So far, this isn't that great of a painting, but it's a good start. And the experience of camping was a lot of fun. This will serve as a good memory of it. Every painting starts somewhere, and there's always an ugly phase to the painting. And I've learned after doing this for a few years that you just need to keep going with it and improve as you go. You're going to see me do a lot more pencil marks before I start blending things with water. My approach to watercolor pencils may seem a little bit odd, because I'm pretty scribbly with my application. I do this because I'm basically mixing colors on the canvas. I'm searching for the right color combination by adding marks in a scribbly way, because I know they will blend once I add water. I am also trying to establish my darks versus lights. I know these trees in the foreground need to be darker in value, but I also know I want them to recede a bit, so this lavender color will help cool off the red pastel pencil I put down earlier. Cooler colors tend to appear further in the distance. The darker purple will also help establish the shadows that appear at the base of those trees. I'm also adding in some grays to keep it from looking too garish, but once I blend the colors with the water, they will become more muted as well. But overall, I'm just continuing my effort to use the lines of the pencil marks to help establish the composition. Like I say, you just need to keep going with it and improve as you go. I'm not too afraid of making mistakes because this is just a hobby, and this certainly isn't the last piece of paper on earth. I consider every piece of art I do practice. I'm exploring and discovering what works and doesn't work. Now it's time to add water. This part always kind of surprises me because in some ways the water and the pigment has a mind of its own. This coated paper is really nice for being able to spread the pigment around without it absorbing too much into the paper. I think a non-absorbent paper is the best way to use watercolor pencils, unless you want to stay much more detailed and photorealistic, but I paint more loosely. These watercolor pencils are the Caran Museum Aquarelle pencils, and you can see they have a really vibrant pigment. It's a premium pencil, so they are a bit more pricey, but I think they're worth it. I'm careful in how I spread the paint at the tops of those foothills. It's a pretty distinct line, but once I get to the trees, I want to try to make them fairly loose. I'm painting with circular motions to help them look like they have a little bit of volume. I think having them be kind of circular helps remind me that they're not just flat trees. I want them to look like they have some volume, and I think the circular brush marks helps with that. I also think it keeps the color variation interesting, because I'm trying not to blend everything together. I think the direction of your brush marks makes a big difference. Since this painting is a memory of my camping trip, I'd be remiss if I left my son out of it. He spent most of the time stoking that fire for me, and this pen is putting in some loose marks that I'll use as a guide for when I paint him in detail later. This pen isn't really working that well on the surface, but it was worth experimenting with, and I kind of like the lighter marks it makes. It's not a bad way to represent the smallest twigs on a tree. For some really bold marks, I decided to use this white acrylic pen. This Sharpie brand works well enough, and I like the feel of the nib, but it doesn't put out as much paint as the Posca brand. Either way, I'm using the white to represent the white trunks of those aspen trees. I could have used an electric eraser maybe, but I can get some pretty interesting marks with the paint markers. With trees, you don't really want perfectly straight lines. In fact, it's kind of good to make them broken lines. They feel more natural that way. For the branches of the trees, I'm using very scribbly strokes, as random as I can make them. And then I'm using a silicone brush to wipe the paint a bit while it's still wet. This will help the marks feel softer. I'll do this a couple of times until I get the overall look and feel to feel about right for the trees. In some ways, I want the tops of the trees to be fairly light because they're reflecting the sun from the sky a little bit, and it helps define this grove of trees against the mountain behind them. I also know I can put the watercolor pencils back on top of any of the white acrylic paint since that's what I primed the surface with to begin with. So I'm not overly concerned about making mistakes with the pen either, which is why I decided I could use the pen to create some snow. The snow was super sporadic on the ground, so I'm good with scribbling the white around to reflect that too. Once I'm done with that, I'll use the pencils again to darken some of the areas to create some contrast near the base of the trees, as well as make some new trees that were a little darker. I also want to make that road look like it travels past the trees to create a little distance in the painting. I kind of enjoyed trying to make the textures that look natural. Nature isn't uniform at all, so I try to make sure that my marks aren't either. It looks like scribbles, but I have a method to my madness. For that evergreen tree, I want to try to make it look less flat. And upon a second look, I realized that there were actually two trees there, one in front of the other. So the front one, I'm going to have a lighter top and a darker base. And then the back one, I'm trying to keep it airy looking because I know there's a lot of sky poking through. I'm also going to try the technique where you wet the core of the pencil in the water. That results in the marks to be really thick and dark as they come off the pencil. It's kind of cool. Now I'm going to create the image of my son tending the fire. That fire pit had a bunch of ice in it when we arrived last night, and I'm trying to get it out, but it was really pretty solid, and I couldn't get it all out. That meant that as the fire warmed up, the newly melted ice would just put things out. It took nearly the whole night to finally get the pit dry enough to make good hot coals for cooking. And since the wood was sort of wet, it made for a smoky campfire. Oh well. Tending the fire is part of the fun of camping, and it was a decent way to pass the time as we talked. Wasn't quite sure how best to do the figure here, and I knew he was bending over and squatting a lot, but I'm glad that I can move the pigment around a bit until it looks right. I can even lift some of it back off, which I think is pretty cool. For the camp chairs and the coolers and the table, I pretty much just blocked them in. Both the water cooler and the food cooler were blue, but I remember having a red one at one point, so I made one of them red just for variety's sake. It still reminds me of camping. For the chairs, I knew the bottoms were darker than the tops because of the shadows and the reflections from the sky, and I'm just trying to get the impression of them. I'm obviously not being too detailed. I'll just let the viewer fill in the gaps. And I almost forgot to make my tail lights red on that truck. My son slept in the back of the truck under the tarp, and I slept in the swag tent on that cot. It was a cold night, but we slept pretty bundled up and warm. I finished with some highlights with the small acrylic marker. That established the lids and the top of the table that the sun was reflecting off. Returning to those trees, I'll add some final dark marks here and there on the trees because aspens are both dark and white, and some of the older ones were quite dark at the top. And I'll put some dark marks here and there on the ground to represent the rocks. I might not be an impressionist, but the marks I put down and the colors I use are loosely representing what I was observing. It's a fun way to paint, even with pencils. All in all, I think it was a fun outing and a fun painting. And if you made it this far in the video, thanks for exploring art with me. I'll see you in the next adventure. Make sure you check out my other videos if you haven't seen them yet. Thanks.